So let's start. Ancient Rome gave us laws, roads, and democracy. But it also gave us something far stranger, rituals so bizarre that even historians struggle to explain what Romans were actually thinking. Every February, in the shadow of the Palatine Hill, Roman priests called Luperci gathered at a sacred cave. This cave, the Lupercal, was believed to be the exact spot where a she-wolf had nursed Romulus and Remus, the twin founders of Rome. And what happened next would make most modern people deeply uncomfortable. Two young priests were brought forward. A goat and a dog were sacrificed. The priests then smeared the blood of the slaughtered animals directly onto the foreheads of those two men, using the bloody knife itself. And then, and this is the part people always remember, they laughed. Ritual laughter, required by the ceremony. After the blood was wiped away with wool soaked in milk, the priests cut strips of skin from the sacrificed goats. These strips were called februa, or thongs. The priests then stripped off most of their clothing, wrapped the thongs around their hands, and ran, actually sprinted, through the crowded streets of Rome, slapping everyone they passed. Women actively sought out these strikes. Being hit by a februa was believed to guarantee fertility and easy childbirth. Crowds lined the streets. People held out their hands, their backs, their arms. Young Roman women in particular considered it an enormous blessing to be struck during this run. So what was really happening here? The Lupercalia was fundamentally a purification ritual. The word February itself comes from februum, meaning cleansing. But it was also a fertility rite, a civic celebration, and a direct performance of Rome's founding myth, all collapsed into a single, chaotic afternoon. Romans weren't just being strange. They were reenacting the wildness of the wolf, the rawness of survival, the moment before civilization. For one day, Rome deliberately stepped backward into something primal, because they believed that touching that primal energy, literally feeling it on their skin, would keep the city strong for another year. The ritual survived well into the Christian era. In 494 AD, Pope Gelasius I finally abolished it, but only after writing an exasperated letter asking why Romans were still running half-naked through the city streets. Some traditions, it turns out, are very hard to kill. In the heart of the Roman Forum stood a small, circular temple. Inside it burned a flame that was never, under any circumstances, allowed to go out. This was the sacred fire of Vesta, goddess of the hearth, and it was tended by 6 women whose lives were unlike those of any other Romans. The Vestal virgins were chosen between the ages of 6 and 10 from Rome's most respected families. Once selected, they served for 30 years. For those 3 decades, they were neither fully part of the world of men nor entirely removed from it. They had enormous legal power. They could free prisoners simply by touching them on the road. Their testimony in court required no oath. Generals made way for their carriages. They sat in the best seats at the gladiatorial games. But the price was severe. Their central obligation was absolute chastity. And Rome enforced this obligation in one of the most disturbing ways imaginable. If a Vestal was found to have broken her vow, she was not killed outright. That would have been considered pollution. Instead, she was placed alive into a small underground chamber near the Colline Gate, given a small amount of food and a lamp, and sealed inside. Rome technically hadn't killed her. The gods would handle the rest. This happened at least 10 recorded times in Roman history. And the reasoning reveals something deeply important about how Romans thought. The Vestals weren't just celibate women. They were living vessels of Rome's sacred power. The flame they tended was mystically connected to the city's survival. If the flame went out, it meant a Vestal had violated her oath, and Rome itself was in danger. Generals reportedly turned armies around upon hearing the flame had been extinguished. When a Vestal's term ended after 30 years, she was released. She could marry. She could do whatever she wished. But most didn't. Life outside the temple, after 3 decades of sacred status, apparently held surprisingly little appeal. The Vestals were Rome's living insurance policy, a permanent, human-scale ritual that kept the city connected to divine protection, burning literally and continuously in the middle of the most powerful city on earth. Before any Roman general marched his army, before any Roman magistrate opened a Senate session, before any major law was passed or temple consecrated, Rome performed a ritual that sounds almost comedic to modern ears. They watched birds. Augury was the practice of reading divine will through the behavior of birds, their flight patterns, the sounds they made, and most importantly, whether sacred chickens ate their grain enthusiastically or not. This was not a fringe superstition practiced by eccentric mystics. This was official Roman state religion, conducted by a formal college of priests called augurs, whose decisions could legally halt an entire military campaign. The augurs were not passive observers. They worked within a carefully defined sacred space called the templum, literally a rectangle of sky marked out with a special staff. What entered that space, and how it moved through it, carried specific meaning. Birds on the left meant one thing. Birds on the right meant another. The eagle of Jupiter carried more authority than a crow. Vultures mattered. Even the sound of thunder from a clear sky was significant. The sacred chickens deserve particular attention. Armies carried them on campaign. Before battle, the chickens were offered grain. If they ate eagerly, even better, if grain fell from their beaks, the omens were favorable. In 249 BC, a Roman consul named Publius Claudius Pulcher received bad news. The chickens refused to eat before a planned naval battle. His response became infamous. He threw the chickens overboard, reportedly saying that if they wouldn't eat, they could drink. He fought anyway. He lost nearly his entire fleet. Romans treated this story not as proof that augury was superstition, but as confirmation that ignoring it had consequences. And there's something genuinely sophisticated beneath the surface here. Augury forced Roman leaders to pause before major decisions. It created a mandatory moment of reflection, of consultation, of collective deliberation. In a culture without opinion polls or statistical modeling, bird behavior became a mechanism for managing uncertainty, a ritualized way of asking whether this moment felt right, and whether the community was truly aligned. Some Roman writers, including Cicero, privately admitted they were skeptical. But even the skeptics continued performing augury, because the ritual wasn't really about the birds. It was about the shared belief that the gods were watching, and that Rome was worth watching over. For 9 days every February, yes, February again, Rome's remarkably strange month, the city effectively shut down its religious life and turned its attention entirely to the dead. The Parentalia was Rome's annual festival of the ancestors, and it operated on a deeply unsettling premise. The dead were always present, always hungry, and if you forgot them, they would make your life considerably worse. Temples closed. Priests suspended official religious functions. Marriages were forbidden during this period. It was considered deeply unlucky to take a new wife while the spirits of the dead were abroad. Romans visited family tombs outside the city walls, bringing offerings of wine, grain, salt, bread soaked in oil, and violets. Violets in particular were associated with the dead and placed directly on grave markers. The Parentalia was not primarily mournful. It was relational. Romans treated their ancestors as members of the family who had simply moved to a different location. Neglecting them was not just impious, it was rude. And Romans believed the consequences of rudeness to dead relatives could be severe. The festival ended with the Feralia, a public ceremony of final offerings to the spirits of all the dead, not just family ancestors, but every unquiet ghost that might be wandering through Rome's streets. The following day brought the Charistia, a living family reunion, a deliberate contrast. Having honored the dead, the living now celebrated their own bonds with a shared meal. What's striking about the Parentalia is how psychologically complete it was. It took seriously the reality of loss, structured grief into communal practice, and then explicitly moved the community back toward the living. Ancient Romans weren't just managing superstition, they were managing collective emotion with real sophistication. The ritual also revealed something Rome understood that many modern cultures have forgotten. The dead don't simply disappear. They live in memory, in obligation, in the stories families tell about who they are and where they came from. Pouring wine on a grave in February wasn't primitive magic. It was a structured way of saying, "We remember you, and remembering you makes us who we are." And perhaps that is the strangest thing about all of Rome's rituals. Strip away the blood, the birds, the sacred fire, and the naked priests running through the city, and underneath, you find people trying to answer the same questions we still haven't fully answered. What do we owe the dead? What protects a city? What makes a life sacred? Rome just answered those questions in ways we no longer expect. Ancient Rome was stranger than most history books admit, and far more human than we give it credit for. If you found any of this genuinely surprising, subscribe for more deep dives into the history that doesn't make it into textbooks. Drop a comment below. Which ritual did you find the strangest?